Seatbelts save lives. It's fundamental, it's obvious. It's just a matter of physics. And we don't need a physics course to understand that. We can illustrate just how effective seatbelts are with just two quick scenarios. Number one, without a seatbelt, a minor accident can have major consequences. A minor accident can become a major accident. So even a fender bender without a seatbelt can result in severe injuries to the occupant. The converse is also true about seatbelts, that with them, we are able to survive some pretty major accidents. Plenty of anecdotes where cars will have flipped and rolled over, maybe gone down an embankment, in which case the occupants would not have survived if they were not strapped in to their seatbelt. It's clear, it's obvious, they make all the difference. It's also true for the Christian. It's our relationship with God that makes all the difference. Without God, some minor setbacks or minor losses would stand to take us under. But likewise, it's with God that we can survive and endure and even grow through the most difficult of circumstances or losses. When we talk about our relationship with God, sometimes we're prone to using the language that says we are in God's hands or in His hand. We sing in other songs. We sang a couple of songs this morning that reflect that truth. We're holding to His hand. We're leaning on His arm. We also sing, "Take my hand, let me stand." Or "Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of your hand." Remember, keep me safe till the storm passes by. When we turn our attention to Psalm 31, what we find is that's a psalm that's described by many as the ups and the downs of a life of faithfulness to God. That David writes a psalm that's kind of odd for him because there's no clear structure in the psalm. That he'll move from one to the other between the heights of joy and trust in God to the shame and the difficulties that he's facing. So it's up and it's down, it's back and it's forth. It's constant. And that's fitting because we all understand that our responses to a difficulty, to a loss, they are never linear. They're never predictable. What we call the grieving process, whether it's over some small loss or over a great loss, is never linear or predictable. And so when we turn our attention to a psalm like Psalm 31, we can find overlap with our own lives, with the experiences of David, because here he is pouring out his heart. And it's up and it's down. And as soon as there's a good, there's something that reminds him that it's tough and it's difficult. And it's within this psalm, a psalm that's characterized by this up and down movement, that he references twice the hand of God. He says in verse 5, "Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God." And he would say, verse 15, that my times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors. You see the wordplay there. My times are in your hand, so rescue me from the hand of my enemies. Now just a quick side note here, verse 14. He says, "But I trust in the Lord," and he says, "You are my God." The more we understand who God is, the more our view of time changes. And here, the recognition is, my time, my times are all within your hand. As we take this connection between the hand of God, we would do well to ask the question, using this psalm as a little bit of a launching point, to say, what do we see? And what do we experience? What do we find when we do remember that we are in the hand of the Lord? So let's open up and begin reading in the first section here. And notice that God shows us, when we're in His hand, He shows us His constant activity. His constant activity. Psalm 31, verse 1. In you, O Lord, do I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. And for your name's sake, you lead me and guide me. You take me out of the net they have hidden for me. For you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. Let's go ahead and read verse 6 even. I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love. Notice, because you have seen my affliction. You have known the distress of my soul. You have not delivered me into the hand of the enemy, and have set my feet in a broad place. What's fascinating to notice there is that David almost works backward from future to present to past. It's not a psalm known for its structure, but you can kind of see that loose structure because he's asking God to do things in the future. He's recognizing what God provides in the present, but that's all built on what God has done in the past. You have redeemed me, verse 5. Verse 7, you have seen my affliction. You know what I'm going through, God. You know the distress of my soul. You know how deeply this has impacted me, God. And you've not let them win. You've not delivered me over into their hands. And so David is highlighting the activity of God in order to then appeal to future activity of God. God is an active God. When we're in the hollow of His hand, He shows us how much He loves us and cares for us by what He continues to do for us. So what this section is doing, just notice, in a loose way, but it's all there. It's who God is. You're my rock, you're my fortress. What He's done, who He is, and what He's doing right now. And then David builds on that his pleas for the future. And then also, especially in verse 5, David says, here's what I'm going to do. So think through those 5 things again. Think about a rope. We think about being in a tough spot and needing rope to pull something out, rope to lift something that's heavy, rope for us to hang on to when we have nothing else to grab onto. And think of these strands that we must weave together in order to latch on to God's strength, who God is, what He has done, what He is doing, what He will do, what we ask Him to do, and what we commit to doing. When we're in His hand, we see how great He is and how active He is. Our confidence rests in knowing that He's always been good. And He's shown us that in how He treats us. He has, so He can. He has before, so He will. And so we may find ourselves from time to time saying, I just don't know if I can handle this. Or I don't know how I'm going to handle this. And God says, I can, and I will, and I will walk with you. Sometimes we say things like, I just don't know what to do because I've never had to do this before. This caught me off guard. This is a surprise, and I just don't know what to do because this is new. And God can confidently say back to us, it's not new to me. I've seen it before. I've experienced it before. I've helped others through this before. So I will help you through this now. What the Lord has done, He will do again. And He will keep doing for us. But number 2 this morning, when we're in the hollow of God's hand, we see that He shows us His gracious acceptance. He accepts us. Listen to how this section begins. Verse 9. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. David says, right now I am distressed. Listen to how he describes that distress. My eye is wasted from grief, my soul and my body also. For my life is spent with sorrow, my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. Now, we don't know for sure if David's speaking just completely literally, that he's having these physical ailments, or if he's just describing the overall general feelings that accompany us when we do have moments of distress and emotional pain. But you and I, no matter what we've been through, we know very well that difficulties and loss have their physical responses. You've been through any of these that David talks about? Ever cried so much you don't have any tears left? Your eyes become red from wiping them so much, they're tender. Your strength has left you and you're so exhausted to walk across the room, you give out. Maybe too exhausted to get out of bed for much time at all. The bones ache. You can't get comfortable. Well, David says it's through my grief. It's through, even he references his own iniquity here. I'm struggling. This hurts. Now, we would probably do well to recognize this, that our pain happens when we have a difficulty. It will find its way out somehow. If we keep it in and we refuse to acknowledge it, to pray about it, to talk about it with others, it will manifest itself in difficult physical ways. So let's appreciate what David's doing. Just by bringing it to the surface, by saying, I'm hurting right now, David is doing a very healthy thing. Just to express that this hurts, that this is difficult. No one can help us to bear burdens. They do not exist. So we bring them into the light. We bring them to the throne of God, and we bring them to one another. But let's keep reading. Verse 14 of Psalm 31. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors. Make your face shine on your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. Verse 21, blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me when I was in a besieged city. I had said in my alarm, I'm cut off from your sight. But you heard the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cried to you for help. See, verses 9 and 10, David expresses his pain. That's healthy. Now he's shifted to even saying, I'm talking about prayer. I'm expressing my reliance on you in prayer. So what a fascinating thing that as David is recording his experience, he looks back on a time of distress and he's able to say, my trust is in God because when I cry out to him, he hears me. Prayer. Prayer is the one place we can always go at any time and share anything and everything we think and feel. And God will understand. And God will move to help us to overcome and to process those feelings. But also notice this idea of verse 16. Make your face shine on your servant. It's kind of balanced a little bit of tension between it and verse 22 because he says, I thought I was cut off from your sight. See, David wants to be in the sight of God, but his circumstances had led him to think, I'm not really in your sight. But I'm reminded that you heard me. So we think about David longing to have the light of God to shine upon him. Think about a cold, wintry day. It's 30 degrees outside. The sun is as bright as it's ever been. It may be the brightest day in the whole year, and yet it's 30 degrees outside because of the great distance. The sun would be farther away on that day than it is, say, a day like today in the middle of August. So when David says, make your face to shine upon me, David first acknowledges the importance of orientation. We need to be turned toward God, and God is turning himself toward us. That's acceptance. But in order for him to shine upon us, it also means proximity, a nearness. So despite our pain, despite possibly previous sin, don't you imagine that some of what David's enemies are taunting him about, maybe looking back on his own indiscretions, maybe taunting him about his failure as a father. But God offers to shine the goodness of his face on David. That's what David longs for. Not only does David want to be in the line of sight, to see God's presence and to be in God's presence, David wants to be near to God's presence so that God's blessings continue to pour into David's life. Because God is generous and abundant, he keeps storing up in his own storehouses in order to pour out into our lives the greatest of blessings, which is himself. And don't miss this idea. Don't miss the contrast between the enemies of David and God, because the enemies leverage shame and taunting, and it's God who offers acceptance. It's God who reminds David, you're mine. I'm your rock. I'm your fortress. I'm the one who will deliver you. And so in the midst of all these ups and the downs, when David recognizes, I'm going to commit to your hand, and my times are in your hand, David also expresses that means God accepts me. He turns toward me. He closes the gap between me and him. But number 3, we learn that God gives us his strength. Look at the final 2 verses. Love the Lord, all you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. It's a little odd to find commands within the Psalms in the first place, but especially now that you've seen 22 verses of David's own experience. It's the ups and the downs. And then now he pivots, and it's no longer about him. He takes his own experience, and then he commands all his people. He wants his nation, he wants all of God's people to know what he knows and has experienced in the calm of God's hand. So he tells them, all of you, love the Lord. All of you, be strong and take courage in your heart from the Lord while you keep waiting on the Lord. Those 2 commands, they make perfect sense. When you've spent 22 verses reading of David's journey up and down, and yet all along saying, but I will trust in the Lord, it's perfectly fitting to then say, love the Lord. Be strong and take courage from the Lord. On one level, it makes sense because it's how he preserves us. The more we keep loving him, the more he keeps preserving us while we wait and fear him. And we keep finding our strength from the Lord. He makes his strength available to us in order to sustain us through things that we otherwise could not handle in this life all on our own. So it's our constant committing to God. It's our constant remaining in his hand that helps us to overcome those scary moments, those difficult losses. Fears will come and go. But we do not have to give fear the power over us. Instead, it's God's strength that helps us to keep sustaining ourselves and endure even in spite of fear. That's why God himself would say, Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 10, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. The more we see what he offers, the more we then love him, the more we draw our strength from him, the greater our path to endurance, even during the most difficult of times. But also, here's another reason this is so important to close this psalm with these 2 verses. Because it's times of fear, it's times of difficulty and loss that make us feel as though we have no control, that we're helpless, that we cannot exercise any kind of strength or power, and yet we can always control that decision to love the Lord. No one, no circumstance, no place, no era of time can ever keep us from loving the Lord. So David closes as if to say, I know you feel like you're out of control. but you can always control your love for God. And then second, I know you feel like you're out of control, but you can always control where you draw your strength from. So draw it from God. You can always choose to take greater courage. You can always choose to take more courage. So go to the source, the greatest power and courage available from God himself. So what a promise. And now what an opportunity for us to carry out those imperatives, those commands, to love the Lord and to take courage from him. One of the unique aspects of this psalm is how in its history after it's been recorded is it's used by multiple authors in both the Old and the New Testaments. Jeremiah would use the phrase terror on every side. That's found in verse 13. He would use it 6 times between Jeremiah and Lamentations. When Jonah is in the belly of the fish, he would quote verse 6. Psalm 71, whether David wrote that psalm or someone else wrote it, they copy the first 3 verses of this psalm as the opening verses of Psalm 71. There are some who think that Paul may be summarizing or at least referencing chapter 31, verse 24 that we just closed with there when he speaks in 1 Corinthians 16. And in verse 13, you remember that one, right? Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Then, of course, it's Jesus there on the cross, who before he breathes his final breaths says, Father, into your hand I commit my spirit. Stephen seems to echo that in Acts chapter 7 and verse 59 when he dies at the hands of the Jews. And think about that for a moment. That David's statement by itself, Psalm 31 and verse 5, it's said about how he lived. What a great way to describe the life of the child of God. I'm going to give my soul and my life into your hands as I live every day. And then to think about what Jesus is communicating when he can look at death being imminent and be able to say, it's into your hands I give my spirit. Very few things that are close to as scary as death is. And yet Jesus says, I can face this with the same confidence that I lived life, which was committing my soul and my life to you. Martin Luther and others kind of summarized this idea by saying, not only can we die for the Lord and in the Lord, but now we have the promise to be able to die with the Lord in his presence. Because of how we live and because of what he makes available in his hand. The scaries of scaries. We get to go with God by our side. Isn't that what David would say elsewhere? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So what a great privilege it is now, just to remember that daily when we're in his hands, we get to draw strength from him, trust him more deeply, thus finding refuge with him more closely. As we close, we call the difficulties of life, we often call them burdens because they weigh us down. They cause this dull weight. And sometimes that weight will come and go. Sometimes it will last for days or even years. David mentioned that, right? My years are full of sighs. One preacher observed, I think accurately, that when we think about the pressures of life's difficulties, we need not get distracted by how great the pressure is. But instead, be sure that we understand where the pressure rests. That the one place we cannot allow the weights of life and the difficulties of life to come is in between us and the Lord. That we cannot allow those difficulties, those difficult emotions that result from those events to drive a wedge between us and God. But instead, we, with that proximity, that orientation, we keep drawing nearer to God. That means those pressures contain that power to push us even nearer to God when we refuse to allow them to come in between us and him. So what a blessing to be able to say, I'm committing my life into your hands. My times are in your hands. This morning, if that's not something you can confidently say, because you know you are outside of Christ, if you need the forgiveness God offers, would you obey Him today? Would you put Him on a baptism where He forgives, where He saves, where He makes you new, where He strengthens and empowers you to handle anything this world can throw at you? Let today be the day you come to Him. Today be the day you obey. If you are a Christian, but you've not been living in a way that honors Him, you've been living in sin, if you need to take care of that in a public way this morning, know that we're here. Please know that God is here for you, and that God longs to forgive you and bless you, as do we. Please pause in your mind. Take this moment as seriously as you can to assess your life and your soul. If you need to make your life right with Him, don't leave this morning without doing it. Would you come now as we sing?